Good evening, everyone. As chair of the History Department's Events Committee and the facilitator for LCSC's Community Research Collective, I am delighted to help celebrate the launch of The Art of Solidarity, Labor, Arts and Heritage in Canada by Between the Lines Press. Co-editors Rob Kristofferson and Stephanie Ross have brought us The Art of Solidarity, which introduces us to the rich tapestry of labor, arts, and heritage in Canada, including such diverse means as protest music, union banners, murals, community theatre, oral histories, workers' history museums, and arts festivals, all showcasing how these expressions of working people's culture have been essential to challenging inequality and fostering solidarity. This inspiring collection, which includes 27 chapters, including artist biographies, highlights the resilience and creativity of labor, arts, and heritage practitioners who, despite financial and organizational challenges, continue to amplify the voices and experience of working class communities. We gather this evening in a world marked by tariff threats, global instability, a deepening inequality. This book challenges us to think about whose work we choose to recognize, whose labor sustains our communities, and how we might build more just and hopeful futures. And I'd like to congratulate Rob, Stephanie, and their numerous contributors on winning the Artist Award for Excellence in Contribution to the Labor Movement in 2025, as well as numerous accolades from experts in the field, and we will hear from one directly tonight as well. And I'll now introduce our speakers for this evening. Rob Kristofferson is Professor of History and Social Justice at Wilfrid Laurier University, where he has also served for 5 years as President of the Faculty Union. He is currently President of the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations, ACUFA. He has worked extensively in workers' public history and labor arts since the mid-1990s, having produced several exhibits, tours, and other programming, including the graphic history Showdown, Making Modern Unions, Between the Lines 2016, which he co-authored with Simon Orpana. He has done much of this work in association with Workers' Arts and Heritage Centre, where he is currently serving on the board of directors. And Stephanie Ross is an associate professor in the School of Labor Studies at McMaster University. Her teaching and research focus on the politics and dynamics of labor movements, especially how unions deal with key questions of structure, democracy, bargaining priorities, political vision, political strategy, and collective identity. She has long been interested in the role of culture in working class communities and in labor movement renewal, and is a past board member of the Workers' Arts and Heritage Centre. She is co-author of Building a Better World, An Introduction to the Labor Movement in Canada. And Greig de Peuter teaches in the Department of Communication Studies at Laurier. He researches work, labor, and collective organizing in media and cultural industries. Some of his recent projects include the artist-commissioned report Artists on Basic Income, Beyond Precarious Livelihoods, co-authored with Nahed Mansour and Rebecca Applebaum, and the book, The New Media Unions, Organizing Digital Journalists, co-authored with Nicole Cohen. We're fortunate to have Greig with us today, and one of the experts who offered praise for this project to offer his remarks as well. So without further ado, I will hand this over to our speakers.
Thanks. Well, it's great to see everyone here tonight. Thanks for coming out, and try to get used to the Zoom environment here. I just want to say we're very proud and excited to welcome you to this event held by Laurier's Centre for the Study of Canada and co-sponsored by the Department of History to launch The Art of Solidarity, Labor, Arts and Heritage in Canada, our new co-edited book published by Between the Lines. And why don't we just introduce ourselves and how we got into this work, maybe?
Sure. Well, I guess there's two ways in which I came to be interested in labor arts and, labor heritage. I'm a labor studies professor, so I've been studying labor history for 25 years. But I think my first contact with labor arts was on the picket line at York University when I was a graduate student. Spent 12 weeks walking around in circles, as many people do when they go on strike in 2000, 2001. And it was a long strike, and friend of mine, a couple of friends of mine, thought that the way that we could best spend our time on the picket line was to sing. And so they brought their guitars, and the three of us sang on the picket line. We went to all the different picket lines at the university. If you've been to York, you know that there's 8 entrances, so that's quite a lot. So we had our own little, little concert tour over the course of 12 weeks. And a lot of the songs we sang were just pop music, things that people would know from the radio and whatnot to keep people's spirits up. But we also had the opportunity to really delve into the tradition of labor music, the tradition of North American labor music. And so we learned and sang all kinds of union songs. And after that, we actually recorded a CD, if you can believe it. And that is a collector's item now, the Kewpie Singers. And that people apparently treasure for some reason. I think we had more enthusiasm than talent. But I think that I tell all of that because, of course, like I met Rob, and well, I met Rob before, but we really spent a lot of time together on the Workers' Arts and Heritage Center board in Hamilton. But I mean, that was really my own first relationship in a practical way to the tradition of labor arts, and got me thinking about how labor arts sustains working class movements, working class communities, and how it allows you to put out into the world an alternative vision of the world. And I was always enthusiastic about that, and was so excited to be able to turn that energy into a book with Rob. So that's my origin story, I guess.
My story starts, not surprisingly, as a graduate student at York University as well. I was doing a PhD dissertation on sort of the working class history of Hamilton, Ontario, and my PhD supervisor, Craig Heron, invited me and a friend of mine, Steve Penfold, which you're probably familiar with his work, to come to this conference. He was holding something about workers in history, and it was at the Steelworkers Hall in Toronto, and basically he wanted us to work the door. So I went to the conference, and it was quite interesting, and I had recently moved back to Hamilton, so there was, before the center opened even in Hamilton, there was the initial programming, which were a series of walking and driving tours that they hired me to undertake for the center, and it involved interviewing folks that were involved in the big strikes of the 30s and 40s, the union organizing drives, and then putting it on a cassette tape, spliced down, very, very difficult work, so the workers themselves were telling the stories of their experiences for people in the present day. And so that was, for someone who was getting my footing in very thick academic research, this was super exciting, and I loved it. And it really was like community-based research, probably before we started calling and examining community-based research and writing all sorts of theoretical articles on it and that sort of thing. And I just kept doing that with the center. I was involved in, I was one of the co-curators of the opening exhibit there. I did other tours, I did other exhibits, I did some virtual museum stuff, and then I did this graphic history with Simon Orpana as well. And more recently, I've been on the board of the center, and that's what I think where we both arrived and started having conversations about this. But before we get into those conversations, we should say some thank yous. So I want to thank again the Center for the Study of Canada, Leanne, Kevin, John McConnell, all the other wonderful folks here at the Center, the Department of History, for co-sponsoring this event. And I also want to thank Greig de Peuter for speaking this evening as well. Very excited to have him.
Yes, and we're also very, very grateful to our publisher, Between the Lines. For anyone who's published a book knows like the press makes or breaks whether the book is successful, honestly. And I think it's been such a superlative experience with BTL. Amanda Crocker, Devin Clancy, Sana Wani, Michael DeForge, who is the artist whose work is featured on the cover. Steve Izima, who's here to sell books today. Tillman Lewis, who is our copy editor. the rest of the editorial collective there. BTL has just been such a wonderful collaborator in this project and really believed in the idea of it from the beginning. And of course, you can't do a book like that, not least with so much illustration, without money. And so it's very expensive to print books with photographs and illustrations. And so we also want to thank the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, the City of Hamilton, and McMaster and Laurier both for contributing to the funds that made the conference that this book is a product of possible, but also the actual printing of the book. So, I mentioned the illustrations, the PowerPoint slides that you see on the screen and in front of you that are rotating are all images that you'll find inside the book. We're also very, very lucky to have all of the contributors of the book provide us with this visual documentation of the work that they've been doing all across Canada. It should be said that this is a book that has been years in the making. It's a project that we started to talk about in 2018 while we were on the board of the Workers' Arts and Heritage Centre. As board members and as academics, we began talking about how we could help that center, which is Canada's only museum-based workers' arts and workers' heritage center in the country. And if you haven't been there, you should definitely go. It's not very far from here. Talking about how we could help to make real its national mandate. And we began to reflect on how the community of labor arts and labor heritage practitioners in Canada was very significant, had been in the game for a long time, but often had very little opportunity to meet with and work with each other because of the scale of the country, because many of these projects were very local and rooted in communities. And so we thought that, we had the ability to convene a conference that would bring people from across the country together for the first time. And that was the conference that we eventually held in June 2023. But of course, something happened between 2018 and 2023. We had been, making the plans to bring people together, and then, of course, the pandemic hit, and we had to put all of these plans on the shelf for quite a while. But we persisted. We eventually held our conference in Hamilton, and the participants were asked to come to present a paper of sorts, reflecting on what they or their organization had done in the past, to tell us about their work, to tell us about their successes and the challenges that they were facing in doing labor arts and labor heritage work. Where did they find themselves today? What current project they felt pointed the way forward for this area of practice more generally. And so over the course of that weekend, where people who maybe had heard about each other, as the labor movement, the left in Canada is not that big. It's big, but it's intimate enough that people would know about each other. Many people were meeting each other for the first time. And the conversations that people had over that weekend were really so rich, were so exciting. People really got to see how common the work was across the country, but also how the challenges that people faced were very, very much shared. And so people went home with feedback to turn their reflections into written chapters, the chapters that you see in the book, and of course accompanied with photographs to illustrate all of the work that they had done. It was this place where people could, who were doing related work from across the country, could meet, could form relationships, ones that we hope will result in not just cross-inspiration, but more collaborations in the future. And I think we see this volume as the first such collaboration, and hopefully in the course of promoting the book, we've had an event in Hamilton, we've had an event in Edmonton, obviously here, but then also in Toronto. We're hoping that people will be able to use this book as a way to further enliven the not just the labor arts and labor heritage work they're doing in their local communities, but also to build their connections with each other over time. So before I go to talk about why I think, or why we think this project is important, an important intervention in labor arts and labor history, in labor studies, we want to say that this volume isn't the final word on labor arts and heritage in Canada. It's really just the beginning. There are many individuals and organizations who were not able to participate in the project, but who are for sure part of the history of this area of work, and are making current important contributions to this work. We hope that this is a first intervention in highlighting how important it is to talk about, highlight, preserve, display this kind of work that often goes invisible and under-recognized, so that more such documentation will take place in the future. So why did we think this was important? Why did we want to have this conference? Why did we want to produce this volume? And I'd say that we have a few kind of key reasons for why we did this. First, it is that we share the view that labor arts and labor heritage are key to sustaining and valuing working people, their communities, their movements, especially in difficult times. As Leanne said, we are living in difficult times. But working class people have always lived in difficult times. And despite that, they have, through that, a long history of commemoration, of cultural and artistic expression. Some of the things that Leanne enumerated, like protest music, union choirs and bands, the construction and display of colorful union banners, which are forms of textile arts and tapestries, murals, posters, posters that are maybe like throwaway are often works of art. It is anywhere you look at a social movement, you will see that culture is an essential part of that movement, of making sense of our individual and collective experiences and expressing them in the context of a society that either marginalizes them or makes them invisible. So for us, because culture is such an essential part of social movements' fight for a better world, it's a glue that unifies people in a shared struggle, gives them a sense of what it is they are fighting for, who they are as a community, how their values are different from the society that oppresses them. We wanted that work to be centered in something like a book. And we are held by the conviction that this work is more important than ever. That we live in an economy not just characterized by growing polarization, inequality, precarity, uncertainty about the future, about the meaning of work, about whether or not we'll even have work that we'll get to do. Labor arts and labor heritage have a central role to play in providing answers that challenge the prevailing narratives about whose work matters, whose efforts are central to our community's well-being. So, this book recognizes that Canada has a rich and varied landscape of labor arts and labor heritage practitioners, and the current expression of that work is rooted in an activist flowering of efforts in the early 1980s. Of course, labor arts and labor heritage extend far back before the 1980s, but the people who are represented in this book and who were really at the core of generating what we call like the contemporary labor arts and labor heritage movement really started to do this work in the early 80s. And they were motivated by a desire to, in some ways, breathe new life into a labor movement that was perhaps becoming more bureaucratized, becoming more of an institution than a movement, that was focused on important, though perhaps more technical aspects of workers' interests, like negotiating collective agreements and dealing with the law and so forth. And instead to use arts and heritage to make connections between the kind of bread and butter activities that unions were focusing on with the culture, experiences, and daily lives of working class people. So some of those attempts were really about trying to push the labor movement of that period beyond what was becoming a more narrow approach to unionism, to think about and contend with the erosion of a lot of the wins, the gains that had been achieved by the labor movement in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. You know, this was an era of the beginnings of neoliberalism and, you know, a new form of globalization. And of course, unions were being put on their back heels, right, on the defensive. A lot of the gains that had been made in those previous periods had been, were starting to be eroded in a significant way. And rather than simply doubling down on the more institutional sides of the labor movement's efforts, you know, the labor arts and labor heritage movement was about trying to re-inject a more movement-like spirit back into those activities. It was a push to have unions recapture their more transformative social movement roots. It was also part of a project to try to expand labor education beyond what it had become, going beyond the skills-based training that many unions had put at the forefront, like, you know, how to file a grievance and how to do a health and safety inspection. All of those things are very important, but you know, there was a desire in this time to use labor history as a way to expose unionists to the broader possibilities of social activism beyond the workplace. And I would say too, you know, in this book, we also talk about how this movement was a challenge to the mainstream of the art establishment. So it's a challenge to the labor movement as it was developing and as it was confronting new problems, but also a challenge to the way that art, institutions, heritage institutions, and the media context were maybe normalizing capitalist practices, capitalist values, and representations of elite life, professions, and cultures that really form the center of our media and cultural landscape. So the book tries to document the rich, varied, and diverse expressions of this work. Certainly not all of the things that could have been said yet in this book, but you definitely see, I think, come away from reading this book with a sense of the vast activity that working people themselves have been engaged in to document their own lives and to have those lives be valued in the public sphere, whether it's through the collection of oral histories, the creation of archives, assembling picture collections, producing local union histories, the playing of labor music, the production of banners, sculpture, photography, film, comics. Really, it is an endless set of efforts. Some of these efforts have been also institutionalized themselves. I mean, the Workers' Arts and Heritage Center is one example of that. But at the same time, we see organizations other festivals like the Mayworks Festival, workplace programs, funding programs that are based in the arts granting councils that were products of this time as well. But what I think we also kind of landed on is that despite the fact that this movement had been so thriving and successful, that it also faced enormous ongoing challenges. And part of our motivation to bring people together as a community across the country was to not just talk about what we had done, what people had done, and to celebrate that, although that was certainly part of it, but it was also to be able to talk practically and strategically about the economic and political environment that was increasingly making sustaining labor arts and labor heritage more difficult. And so I'll turn it over to Rob now to talk about what those issues are and how our book deals with some of them. All right.
Okay, thanks. So what are those challenges and what impacts are they having on our ability to do the work of labor arts and labor heritage? I'm going to give you a list. It's going to be numbered. So first, we work in the context of dominant cultural forces that marginalize or they make invisible working people's lives and contributions, past or present, in which people are encouraged to aspire to elite lifestyles, and in which the logic of capital is often just unquestioned. This has been accelerated, of course, as attacks on working people by capital in the state have intensified in the wake of the Great Recession of 2008, leaving labor arts and heritage practitioners to contend with how to engage with the working class whose lives and organizations are undergoing profound transformation. And as the economic formation around us all also is changing, ever changing. As labor movement and broader activist networks devise new ways to build solidarity in an austere and a precarious world, we asked, how must labor, arts, and heritage practitioners follow suit to consider what Heron and Smith call how workers themselves can be supported to rebuild the solidarity necessary to think as a class? Second, while labor, heritage, and arts are often combined in practice, their relationship remains underexplored. I always wondered, like, how do they fit together? And I always look for a piece of writing on that. It's underexplored in the literature on public history, on labor art, workers' history, or the literature on artist social practice. And especially given the intensifying attacks we've referred to above, we need to ask, how do we more clearly conceptualize the relationship between these two things, arts and heritage? While both labor, art, and heritage can be distinct areas of practice, they both make visible the stories, voices, and experience of people who are rendered invisible by structures of dominance. So labor arts, it does this by, according to Peter Sawchuk, by, quote, offering a powerful, immediate, gut-level awareness of a complex social reality, end quote. And it does that through multiple mediums where working class standpoints are highlighted. Labor arts enhances workers' understanding of the meanings, the contradictions, the complexities of working class lives by revealing, at least temporarily, the capitalist structures typically hidden from view in a media context that normalizes representations of elite lives, professions, and cultures. Labor art also opens up space for working class people to imagine differently, and to consider possibilities for new types of social relationships. In this way, labor art offers means that reflect the ends, where workers themselves create depictions of their realities, and therefore they prefigure a more democratic and egalitarian society. Labor art can also inject flagging labor movements with new life by adding breadth to labor education curricula, by expanding its focus beyond that of traditional business unionism, by complementing mobilization strategies with art that communicates messages and meanings in more visceral ways, and by broadening alliances by building bridges between activist movements and other communities. These forms of labor art carve out space in opposition to and in tension with the dominant sort of art system, comprised of well-funded elite institutions backed by well-heeled donors, also a powerful arts mediascape, and the art education complex. Turning now to heritage, heritage is also a political landscape upon which different groups compete for position within the larger structure of society's hegemonic power relations. As with labor art, labor heritage as a radical practice must also contend with the social and economic forces that seek to subordinate memories of collective struggle and working class achievement to narratives instead that favor present day interests of the dominant class, and in the process, erasing possibilities for a collective memory of historical class experience to inform working class responses to contemporary struggles. These factors confront radical labor heritage practitioners in a variety of ways, including the active state repression of labor heritage projects subsumed in the individualizing narratives of neoliberalism, or in the oppositional influence of gentrification advocates and civic boosters, or the liberal viewpoints of industrial heritage practitioners. I did a big industrial heritage project once, and it was a new undertaking for me to deal with, try to reconcile those views with my vision of the project. But also in the sapping energies of middle-class heritage professionals, or getting stuck in the machine of the corporatized museum industrial complex and its associated depoliticizing fundraising activities. Despite these oppositional forces, labor heritage that focuses on bringing past experiences to the present consideration of the working class has established widespread roots in Canada and internationally. Labor heritage practices provide modern movements with a window to view previous social movements and collective activities, previous eras when social reality emboldened working people to act on their own behalf, and therefore serves to expand visions of what's possible here in the present. Labor heritage enables workers to situate contemporary experience of class and class struggle in what Alan Sears calls the, quote, larger processes that frame our realities, end quote, resulting in the widening of what he calls possibilities for action. So it's at this point in history necessary to consider labor arts and labor heritage within the same conversation. Both illuminate and sustain the often hidden realities of working people, their contributions to and their aspirations for social and economic justice, equity and inclusion, those things that capitalist structures of domination seek to block out. Both shift the focus away from bureaucratized business unionism, the mind-numbing effects of routinized labor, or the constant struggle to reconcile the family economy, and move that onto the bigger picture, allowing workers to question present realities and formulate visions of alternative futures, whether by remembering the past and getting sustenance and information from past struggles, or by imagining different ways of living and relating. Both also draw on common activist bases. Developing this understanding of their relationship allows us to move forward and to address such questions as how then can we sustain labor arts and heritage work in ways that are not subsumed by the systems they seek to critique, or in a context that encourages forgetting, escape, and consumption to cope with our economic, social, personal, and environmental crises. How can labor arts and heritage have an impact in that context? Third, we found decades of attacks on unions and on public funding for arts and heritage have increased the precarity of labor arts and heritage work. It's destabilized the financial basis of our efforts, and it's often put people doing this work in permanent crisis mode. Many arts organizations must constantly chase funding to keep their actual or their metaphorical doors open, pulling scarce energies away from doing the work. A labor movement that itself is on the defensive often these days is a particular challenge for labor arts and heritage, given how important they've been as a source of partnership and a source of funding. Unions themselves in crisis often see labor arts and heritage as a frill, as something to put aside when needing to focus on what many of them see as the core mission or survival of the organization. Labor arts and heritage practitioners also have to contend with how to engage a working class whose lives and organization are undergoing profound transformation and who themselves are struggling for survival. For example, the volunteer labor that traditionally supported so much workers' cultural work was based largely on individuals with the time and the resources to provide that labor, helped along by defined working hours and often high-wage full-time work that we saw in the post-war economy. Today, a younger generation of would-be volunteers faces formidable barriers to participation as they themselves are navigating low-wage, precarious employment that often includes multiple paid gigs to keep things going. So how then can we explore in this volume, as we try to explore in this volume, how then can we sustain labor arts and heritage work in ways that are not subsumed by all of this stuff, particularly when our alternative sources of sustenance are also under pressure? Fourth, we're faced with an imperative to consider, to rethink and expand whose stories are being told and represented. The roots of many labor arts and heritage initiatives are in partnership with unions, yet the vast majority of working people remain outside the union movement. How has this partnership shaped how we understand the working class and whose stories get told in labor arts and heritage? What other organizations should labor arts and heritage practitioners be connecting with? These issues have a wider political and cultural salience, as we've all been challenged to reconsider the implicit assumptions that we make about who is a worker, whose histories and experience count as labor stories, and who has the right or support to actually tell these stories. Indeed, as Min Suk Lee's reflections in this volume poignantly ask, whose work gets to count as art and who gets the credibility to tell their stories? Finally, which will be number 5, because I promised a numbered list, we work in an ever-changing technological landscape that shapes how people engage with their culture and their heritage. Newer generations of working people are fully engaged in a media and a digital landscape that's very different from the many standard forms of labor arts and heritage. I know since my involvement in the mid-90s to now, it's just breathtaking, the changes that I'm trying to reconcile myself to. So in that context, we asked, what's the impact of digital and social media on labor arts and labor heritage work? What are the possibilities and challenges of using these new technologies?
So once, having said all of that, which we've said quite a lot, and we're going to turn it over to Greg momentarily, Rob and I feel that both the conference and the book have achieved a number of important aims that we started out with. We learned from each other about our successes, our challenges, our plans. We now share that learning with the readers of the volume, and hopefully there will be many such readers. I think that we have succeeded in using this project to build relationships based on aspirations of solidarity, of mutual aid, bringing together people who will hopefully work together in the future. We hope that the book helps to contribute to the whole community of labor arts and labor heritage practitioners across the country, giving them perhaps some renewed energy, finding new ways to sustain their work. And I think that ultimately, you know, this is something that this book wouldn't have been possible without all of the labor that, you know, has been kind of circulating on this slideshow as we've been talking. The enormous amount of commitment for decades on the part of many people whose names most Canadians will never know, but who have carried the banner of labor arts and labor heritage because they know that it is such an integral part of defining who we are as working people and what kind of society we're fighting for. And so we very much hope that this book not just reflects on the past, but also helps to spark conversations about the future prospects of labor arts and labor heritage in a moment when we desperately need strong, confident visions of the future driven by social movements who themselves are going to create the future that we all need and want. Thanks so much.
So when Rob and Stephanie approached me about this, they said they didn't want it to be onerous. So I gave myself one slide. So I took you at your word, but it is a very important slide. I will return to it in just a minute. I don't have a numbered list. I have a series of fragments, I think, is the honest way to characterize what I have to share. So first, I want to congratulate Stephanie and Rob and all of their contributors on this wonderful book. And thank you too for your great talk. I think showing us what is at stake in this work and why it matters beyond even the individual projects that are profiled within it. The Art of Solidarity is that rare collection that in its very form materializes its editorial vision. It serves as a document of collective memory, profiling and preserving significant and often unsung protagonists of labor arts and heritage in Canada. It showcases the vibrancy of the field without at all sugarcoating its strains and its challenges, which were spoken to in the presentation. My work is at the edges, I would say, of labor arts and heritage. I think that there are still a lot of affinities, but nonetheless, there's a lot in this collection that resonated for me. Here begin some fragments. So for one, I deeply admire the book's consistency of means and ends, or the prominence of firsthand accounts. By casting artists and working people as active agents, the book enacts its commitment to self-representation, giving voices to artists and other cultural workers to tell their own stories. I also want to give a shout out to the political conditions of the book's production. Its publisher, Between the Lines, already mentioned, is, I believe, correct me now if I am wrong, a worker-owned press. Its motto, "Books Without Bosses," is not only a snappy slogan, but one that I think is highly portable. We could substitute books, I think, with all sorts of things that we could make without bosses. Another quality that I especially value is how the book spotlights working class cultural institutions. I know there are an array of practices and artists that are profiled too, but one thing that I especially value is the emphasis on institutions. Institutions that artists, activists, and their allies have built to support and to sustain labor arts and heritage. At a moment when activism, even in our dire moment, can often feel like a series of one-off, fleeting interventions. This emphasis on building durable institutions is timely, instructive, and necessary. There's so much that we have to learn, I think, from dwelling with these experiences of creating worker-led cultural institutions, their conditions of possibility, the community formations that enable them, and the diverse skills mobilized to make it happen. This aspect of the book is, in a sense, a case study in the institution building work that must be done across so many domains within and well beyond the labor movement. The spaces and projects documented here are valuable, I think, not only because they help to preserve the memory of working class culture and politics, they also remain living spaces for ongoing conversation, debate, strategy, and social connection. In short, spaces and practices to reproduce community capacities needed for struggles of all kinds that lie ahead. I also really appreciate the expansive view of working class experience that the book captures, which I think now we can frame as a kind of reaffirmation of the multiplicity inherent in the contemporary and historical working class, one that's especially vital today amid post-Trump discourses, including those on the labor left, where there's narrowing attention to the white working class and the reactionary rapid rollback of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So the research that I do isn't located in the field of labor arts and heritage per se. I do collaborative work on how artists and other cultural workers collectively organize to resist exploitation, precarity, inequality, and also, and in those very processes, develop new alternative democratic infrastructures of mutual aid and provision. So reading The Art of Solidarity convinced me that labor arts and heritage is a necessary additional pillar to the kind of work that we do. Work that we sometimes give the umbrella title of the laboring of culture. So not so much labor arts, but the laboring of culture or the laboring of communication. A stolen phrase, of course, this one from the historian Michael Denning in his 1997 book, The Cultural Front, The Laboring of American Culture in the 20th Century. In that book, Denning traces how in the 1930s and 40s, in particular in the US, emergent cultural industries, new unions, and progressive organizational energies intertwined with a spirit of cultural experimentation that deeply shaped social and cultural life in the US during the Great Depression era and after. By the laboring of culture, Denning is naming several threads, and I'll just list off some of them. He's referring to things like the growing use of the language of work and labor in everyday life. He's referring to the new visibility of the labor of cultural production. He's talking about the unionization of cultural workers for the first time in many cases in that era. He's talking about the entry of working class people into cultural sector jobs that previously they had been excluded from. And he's also talking about the spread of social democratic culture through the cultural apparatus. So these developments and others, he argues, were bound up with a broader cultural front, a diffuse but solidaristic cultural worker alliance infused with the popular front politics of the time and arising from a shared experience of crisis and also of possibility. To state the obvious, it seems to me that we need a new cultural front. Since the 2010s, our own research has explored a renewed laboring of culture in the present. This is work that I undertake with a number of collaborators, but in particular, Enda Brophy from Simon Fraser University and Nicole Cohen from the University of Toronto. So what I thought I'd do is just flag a few examples from the landscape of cultural labor politics that we look at, which might be seen as sitting alongside the field of labor arts chronicled in Stephanie and Rob's book. And this is more random fragments. For starters, we've seen a surge of union organizing in the arts, in media, and cultural industries, and even in quarters of the tech industry. A lot of it has admittedly unfolded in the United States, but Canada too has seen a wave of organizing in journalism, in museums, in video game studios, in animation, in record labels, and much, much more. And one of the many things that's propelling this organizing activity is a growing embrace of a worker identity. Another thing that's mobilizing this activity is not only material bread and butter issues, but concerns about equity, diversity, and inclusion, which are often foundational motivations for these organizing drives, and certainly not secondary to other concerns that workers have. And while these workers may not be in the field of labor arts per se, there are ways in which these newly democratized cultural workplaces are moving their content and their internal practices toward a pro-worker perspective. This is more difficult to track, but we are increasingly convinced that media outlets that unionize speak differently when they report on labor issues. There's a shift in the kind of coverage that takes place. And I think the same goes with a number of other sectors where we're seeing new organizing happening. The art of solidarity acknowledges the risks of an excessive focus on unions in labor arts. I think rightly so. Not all workers have legal access to unions, and many groups of workers have been excluded from them. Among art and cultural workers in Canada, we've also seen an uptick in interest in a different worker organizing model, and that's worker cooperatives, or businesses that are owned and governed by the people who work in them. Canada has several interesting and important examples. The longest running may be the Keengate Cooperative of Inuit artists and printmakers in Nunavut, active for decades. More recently, a group of artists in Vancouver founded the Union Cooperative Initiative, which is incubating worker-owned cultural sector businesses. Even in tech, worker-owned businesses are emerging, a couple tech development companies in Toronto. Locally, we have a relatively new worker-owned architecture firm called Arise Architects. In Victoria, British Columbia, there's Stocksy, an artist-owned stock photography co-op with more than 1,000 members. I'm going to say these are all kind of dimensions of labor arts, even if they aren't often recognized as such. In another strand of cultural labor activism in Canada that we explore, we've seen artists take the lead in advocating for basic income. One of the contributors to Stephanie and Rob's book, Carl Beveridge, along with his late partner, Carol Condé, and many others, formed the now defunct Independent Artists Union, or the IAU. Cue slide. The IAU organized Ontario artists under the slogan, Canada needs a living wage, Canada needs a living culture, artists need a living wage. The group pushed to extend collective bargaining rights to visual artists and made considerable headway in doing that. And they very cleverly argued that because much of their artwork was funded by government grants, they should be considered government employees. And on account of that, should be able to enter into negotiations with the Ontario Ministry of Culture at the time. And they advocated fervently for what they called a living wage, or what we would call now basic income. I'm currently working on a book in collaboration with Sarah Smith at Western about the IAU. Much of the IAU's organizing took place within another uniquely Canadian institutional contribution to labor arts, which is the artist-run center, right? So it's very difficult to imagine the kind of organizing that the IAU did without having these institutions that provided spaces where conversation, strategizing, disagreements of all kinds could unfold. In our research, we've also seen artists engage in a diversity of tactics, from taking over buildings as performance spaces through to online tactics like art and museum transparency, a crowdsourced spreadsheet where art workers shared their position as well as their wages, starting public conversations about unsustainably low pay and opaque payment practices in museums. Even these one-off interventions oftentimes laid conditions of possibility for formal unionization drives to start. So you never know. Across all of this activity, we see something that also runs through the art of solidarity, a practice that in our research we sometimes call autonomous communication, where workers repurpose the skills they typically deploy in commodified cultural production and instead turn those capacities to alternative ends like labor organizing or institution building. So I'm going to close just by noting a few questions, either for now or another time, but short questions that came to my mind as I was kind of revisiting the book today. And that's, how can labor arts and heritage be made engaging for young workers? I wonder about the generational composition of a lot of the projects and practices that are profiled in the book, next to the research that we're doing, which is really dominated by young workers for the most part. Curious, what do labor arts look like in a digital age? You know, beyond the utilization of digital tools for existing labor arts and heritage organizations, thinking more broadly and creatively. I'm also curious about the conceptual borders between what we're calling labor arts and just pro-worker narratives in commercial cultural production, of which we see, I would argue, an increasing amount. So what are the boundaries between labor arts and progressive narratives about work and labor in mainstream popular culture produced by working people? And does the field of labor arts run the risk of reducing culture to a mere resource for labor activism? Is there a kind of instrumentalization of culture that haunts labor arts and heritage? So I'll leave it at that, but thank you again and congratulations on a wonderful book.
All right. Thank you to all three of our speakers for this evening. I'd like to open the floor to questions. So feel free, if you're joining us online, to put your questions into the chat. Or if we have any in the room, we can.
Thanks very much for the talk tonight, to both of you and to Greg as well for commenting. I'm curious to know whether or not you noticed in your research, when we think about the labor movement, and we think about labor generally, the notion of solidarity is the thing that comes to mind first and foremost. I'm wondering if, as you were doing your work, or your contributors were doing their work, were they finding evidence also of arts and heritage being used, not so much for the promotion of solidarity, but also sort of divisions within the larger labor movement. So, were you seeing, examples of art and heritage actually being used not as a means of fostering solidarity, but actually arts and heritage being used in ways that might undermine solidarity along gendered lines or racialized lines? I wondered if that entered into the discussion at all.
I mean, that's an interesting question. I feel like the the people who contributed to the book are very much unified by the idea that art should be bringing people in to the movement. I think it's fair to say that, in having, critical reflections about like the origins of this movement and how it's evolved over time, I think that the early stories that were being told did focus on what, from this vantage point, might seem like a narrower group of people. We might generalize to say like the stories of the unionized industrial male working class tended to be at the center, as they are at the center of labor history. But I actually was very much like I was actually comforted by the fact that these organizations and these contributors actually showed a real sensitivity to that issue from the very early days of this movement. So like Rob can speak to this, I think, more in detail because he co-authored the chapter with Florencia Berenstein about the Workers' Arts and Heritage Center. And I mean, there's no question, like WAC, like other institutions, we've struggled with this idea of who's a worker and how do we include people who are non-union and who are not white male working class people into the museum, right? But if you look back at the history of the exhibitions that WAC has done since 1996, they really are remarkably inclusive. In fact, I was very comforted by that. And I think that is, even if each project was not successful, I think at being maximally inclusive, I think that the sum total of the movement's efforts is always to try to bring in another group of people whose stories may not have been told, and to try to make the connection between the particular and the general, right? To say, okay, yes, you have a particular story that needs to be told. You have a particular experience of exploitation or oppression or what have you, but we can see the sympathy here. We can see the resonances here with an overall understanding of the subordination of working people. And I feel like that actually, I'm much more comforted having done the book now. It kind of disabused me of some assumptions that this movement was more exclusivist than I think it actually ever was. I think I would stand on that.
Yeah, I was very surprised. I had a database built with the help of the Center for the Study of Canada, who got a grad student to build it, of the exhibitions done over the years at WAC. And I was involved in the first exhibition, which was on the 1946 strikes and steel workers, rubber workers, electrical workers. And at that time received a good deal of criticism for being so exclusively focused on white male working class industrial experience. But right after that, there were a series of exhibitions, some focusing on Latin America. Mendelsohn Joe did one on women in work, Carol Conde. By the early 2000s, just a few years in, we did a major exhibition called And Still I Rise, a history of African Canadian workers in Ontario, that went on to travel a whole bunch of places. So it really was a multifaceted thing. I think, being kind of intimately involved in the day-to-day activities, then it kind of worked. I guess I don't know much about social science, but you do something called snowball sampling.
Yes, that's
I think that just means one thing leads to another. Is that right?
That's
Okay.
right.
So a lot of it was that. I mean, WAC is in a old building in a working class ward of Hamilton, or at least back then it was a working class ward. It's under change right now. And so it like engaged with its community, and just going out and meeting the different people in the community started people thinking of different possibilities of projects and where the holes were, where we needed to go, and of course building up trust in the community, you know, enabled us to get to a point where different community organizations felt comfortable coming and engaging with us and working with us on projects.
I just want to add one thing though, because I don't want, like, Greg, you're right to say, like, we don't sugarcoat things. Like, I think that there is a, like, I think people did feel that as these institutions were being developed, that they also needed to be challenged in terms of, you know, who was at the table. But I think that's partly because of the way that various institutions were at the center of building the labor arts and heritage movement. So if the labor movement is, you know, a particular institutional space that is lending support for the development of labor arts and heritage projects, well, that's going to reflect that certain people are going to be at the table and they're going to tell stories from that vantage point. And you have, you know, a working class that's much more diverse, that's on the outside of unions as an institution for, you know, for quite a long time. I think those things have changed. And although we still have 70% of Canadian workers that are not in unions, and there's no question that racialized workers, Indigenous workers are underrepresented in those institutions. And so insofar as institutions are building institutions, that does create a sense of who's on the inside and who's on the outside. So, you know, some of these chapters do talk about people who took it as their mission to challenge the narrowness of even these labor arts and heritage projects. But I think that where we are today, there is, I think, a widespread acceptance in the sector that that was a good development. And that has been internalized in a very significant way in all of the thinking. So I think that's the case. Yeah.
Question for any of the presenters. What are some specific artists or pieces of art that you encountered during this project that resonated with you?
Well, I think for me, it was the Graphic History Collective, but that's not very fair because I did a graphic history too. And they kind
That
of
might be why it resonated.
they had done their May Day graphic history at that point, and that inspired Simon and I to do the one based on the wave of strikes in 1946 in Hamilton. But they, you know, they're a really interesting they're a collective, and they do a lot of work on talking about what it means to do the work, what it means to, you know, devote the time in the midst of the reality of, you know, going to your question on youth, realities of employment and balancing life. So at the end of that chapter, there's a sleeping IWW Sabo cat, which is sort of their, you know, it's their gesture towards transformative justice and the need to, like, part of being in the struggle and struggling against capitalism is, and defying capitalism and oppression is having that space to rest. And so to make that a collective value of theirs was really inspiring. But of course, their art and the way that particularly Sean Carlton has connected comics art with activism by talking about Paulo Freire's concept of conscientization, where, you know, you have this active movement from panel to panel in the gutter. You know, you see someone standing beside someone with an axe, and then in the next thing you see a word that says, ah, and then you assume what happens, right? That's bringing the reader in through an act called closure to be an active participant in the comics, and they really built that in very interesting ways. And Sean has a great essay on it in Labor Le Travail.
Mhm. I would say in this book, I would say two pieces or two things really had an impact. I mean, I think Rob's right. Like the Graphic History Collective is so creative, so interesting. Really, everyone should read their stuff. It's like, you know, public history done right. Like, by the way, I assigned your book, Showdown, to a class of non-degree learners that I'm teaching at Mac this year, and like rave reviews, like to learn about the Stelco strike of 1946 in that format, like just people just could not say enough good things about it. So like it tells you the power of communicating academic or historical knowledge in these ways. I would say two other things. One is Carl Beveridge and Carol Condi's collage, The Shape of Water, I found very impactful. Like, so I believe it might be in the color, insert. Oh, it's not a color. Well, you should look at it online because it is, they take inspiration from, you know, a piece of something from the conventional art canon, which is, I think, Bruegel's The Fall of Man or something, right?
Yeah, the fall of some religious.
And so it's like this panoply of, I don't know, like people going to hell, basically, like, but they take the composition of that and they re-articulate it with like struggles over water privatization around the world. And
on Cochabamba,
in particular in Bolivia. And it's so interesting, creative, like it's sort of making the repurposing. So I was very struck by that as an artistic practice, and found it very powerful. But I think the other thing that I think is really powerful in the book was the work that's done by Quentin Bayan, which is this collective of two Filipino artists who work very closely with the Filipino community, the live-in caregiver community, to co-produce artistic expressions of their experience. And so they use comics also as a form. But I think what was more powerful to me about that was not so much the form, although it is impactful, but the insistence that living caregivers themselves have, important. They need to be at the center of telling of developing the art and telling their stories, because they are not victims. Like I think often academic research talks about the living caregiver program and other temporary foreign worker programs participants as victims. And of course they are being victimized, but to say that they are being exploited or oppressed is not the same as treating people as victims without agency. And so I found that their artistic method was very important, because, and it speaks to what Greg was talking about this relationship between like theory and practice in a way. Like you enact this idea that that working people themselves have to be participating in their own representations, not merely to be represented by others. And I think that they do that really powerfully.
I have one more online. Do you include ACTRA members as part of your history?
I think the answer is no. We don't. And that maybe speaks something to the way that like Greg's work and our work are kind of side by side, but not exactly the same, because, there's a way in which, yeah, a lot of cultural workers are actually union members. But I think that goes to the question you were asking earlier. It's like, well, what is the relationship? In some senses, this is a question about who controls the art that gets made, right? And so, yeah, like obviously, ACTRA members are part of, they're part of the working class in that sense. They have a union. They are doing labor, but to what extent are they in control of the artistic representations that they are part of, right? That is still actually in the control of, big private agglomerations of capital who are deciding how that artistic labor is deployed. So in that sense, we don't really talk about cultural workers in that respect, although Davina DeRoche's chapter at the end really gestures more towards that when she is a chapter about the unionization of cultural workers or museum workers in North America. So it's sort of a bit of a bridge to that, but no, we don't. And I think that is an interesting future exploration, especially given what Greig has posed, is that, as these spaces of more conventional cultural production are increasingly unionized, how does that affect the content of what is produced? I think that's a very debatable and open question because, of course, Hollywood is one of the most highly unionized spaces, but it still is the center of, cultural production that I think we would say is primarily reproducing dominant ideas of capitalism and, capitalism as culture, capitalism as a ethos that, is the air we breathe. And so, unionization isn't enough,
Great. Do we have any more questions in the room?
I'm happy to go to Greg's question on youth,
yeah.
involving youth workers, because that is something that, I have noticed is if you look across the landscape, there are labor heritage practitioners, I'll talk of primarily, who are, have been doing it for a long time, and have a certain vision of it. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of uptake from the next generation or the generation after that sort of thing. So the question becomes like, how do you draw younger people in? At the Workers' Arts and Heritage Center, we started a youth program, school program, that's been highly successful and has actually been pretty significant in terms of revenue, and revenues were part of our conversation as well at the conference. But we also started a youth council, and it actually was quite active. I think they still do meet. And I think the secret with that is leaving the space for it, just to be frank. Like, I'm a 60-year-old white man, and so being very conscious of like, what do I have and what space can I create? How do you reconcile that with the realities, as I talked about with the Graphic History Collective, of the amount of time you have on your hands, rest is resistance, all that sort of stuff. But it may also have to do with just conceptualizing new approaches to programming. I did a walking tour pilot a few years ago now, where I took a group of young folks, like 25 to 35, around 19th century parts of Hamilton to talk about experiences of precarity in 19th century Hamilton. And all of these folks that this wonderful person at the center, Jordan, rounded up for the tour were experiencing precarity. And so I would go to a site, I talk for 2 minutes about the history of the site, and then I pass the microphone off. And it was a bit slow on the uptake at first, but by the time we got to the third site, like something was happening, right? And I could feel what was happening is people were very excited that they were not isolated in their experience, that this actually was part of a larger phenomena that not just today, but extending back in time, right? So I've meant to go back to that and see what building can be done. But perhaps there's something in there that
Mhm.
can be of value.
I'll just add this and maybe to finish on what something or elaborate on something that Rob said, which is that I think in some ways, because we like the things that we produce, we think they're good, and but even though and they certainly are, and they serve a certain audience. And I think that in some ways, people who are frustrated with the lack of youth engagement are asking we're asking the wrong question. We're asking, why aren't they interested in what we're doing? Rather than what do they say about their own lives? What would they say about their own lives? How can we help them be in a position to represent their own lives in artistic or other ways? And so, I think that actually has to be the question, and that has to be the challenge to this movement. If we want to be sustainable, it's like provide the infrastructure for new generations of people to make of it what they will, make representations of their lived realities of work, of precarity, of in all of its forms, rather than ask, why are they not interested in the things that we have deemed important up till now? So that, I think that's how I would leave this conversation, is to say, it's important for us to keep doing the things that we believe is important, but we do not have the final answer on how new generations of workers should be represented. That is for them to do. And so what role can we play in actually making that possible and viable for them?
This is really stimulating. I've been thinking about these sorts of things for a long time, because, which is why we started up Between the Lines in the 70s, as a way of talking about, one of the important things was talking about the culture of work, because the two groups that started up Between the Lines were co-ops as well. Dumont Press Graphics, which existed here in Kitchener-Waterloo, as a worker co-op, doing the physical work of putting in information and knowledge on paper, and the Development Education Center in Toronto, which did the work of thinking and researching and debating and bringing together different kinds of knowledge. And we pooled our resources in order to create a publishing company, which we hoped would make a difference. And that's always really hard to assess. But what you're really stimulating me to think about right now is, how do we think about the location of where is the space where people, whether they are working or not, engage in cultural activities? Clearly, unions have historically had the resources to stimulate thinking about the working class, the condition of workers. But I don't think anybody said anything about where people who work live and what goes on in their neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Neighborhoods, of course, have transformed considerably throughout the history of labor. Even here in Kitchener, when my dad grew up, he walked to his factory job. Most people did. When I was growing up, I'd still see people walking on the streets in the morning to get to work. Then all the central industrial activity in Kitchener, and I think in Waterloo as well, all of a sudden it moved out to the suburbs.
Yeah.
Moved out to the outside of town, and people were less in their neighborhoods for fewer hours of the day. Right now, last week I was at a meeting of a neighborhood association. There is a place, there is a resource that brings people together to think about their living conditions and their culture and the activities within their neighborhood. And of course, most people in our neighborhood go out to jobs. I mean, they're working class in a sense. You raised the question of what is working class. Well, we got to talk about that a lot. But so how the opening up the potential that you have been describing about the history of cultural activities among working people has increasingly, I think, needs to take into account where people live because they're encountering their neighbors. They need to encounter their neighbors more. Their ability to encounter their colleagues at work become narrower and narrower, especially for jobs where you're working from home and so on. So let's look at strong communities. Labor is a really, really important part of strong communities, labor organizations and so on, and thinking about where you work and struggling with all the dilemmas of where you work is really important. But for to become strong, sustainable communities and people who are fulfilled, we need to somehow bring in community activities, it seems to me, neighborhood activities and stuff.
I think what this is, Steve, this is a very important intervention. And I was thinking about this issue when Greg was also talking about the fact that, you know, how important it is to build institutions, and because institutions are a way to kind of sustain activity when things are very unstable. But it put me also in mind of this idea that Alan Sears, who's I think now a retired professor from TMU in Toronto, developed, called the infrastructure of dissent, which is a concept that I find very important in my thinking and teaching about labor movements. And the idea behind this is that he was a professor at the University of Windsor for a long time, and so he was thinking about what were the social and even geographical conditions that produced and reproduced a strong, vibrant, working class community. And so he developed this concept of infrastructures of dissent to describe the way in which, in the past, at least for the industrial working classes of Canadian cities, people lived and worked in proximity to each other. So you were part of a tight-knit community that had all kinds of other institutions where you would meet, like the tavern or the ethnic association, the hall, that or over the back fence, or at the local grocer, or that there was a lived reality, a geography that sustained not just the spaces where people could produce a similar set of ideas, but actually could debate and argue about what was important to working class community, should be the priorities, how should we view things. And then, you can add all kinds of other cultural institutions or practices like working class sports teams and leagues and, all of those things that knit people together outside of work as part of a shared lived reality. And so his idea was that it has been that, that the suburbanization in North America has broken apart all of those infrastructures of dissent and made it much more difficult for the activity that we're describing to be reproduced in people's daily lives in their neighborhoods. Or that people don't live and work in the same places. And so even if you work together, you don't live near each other most often. So where else do we look? Well, in my thinking about these things, I think that there are ways in which not all parts of the working class's infrastructures of dissent are destroyed, that there are many places, many neighborhoods where people continue to have those kinds of relationships, where they live and work close together, but it tends not to be the white industrial working class. It tends to be communities that are subject to various forms of, housing segregation or marginalization, that also then are knit together by other institutions like faith institutions, right? Shared, church as a space where people meet and reproduce shared values. So like it isn't the case that all of the infrastructures of dissent of working class people have been destroyed. It's just that the ones that we identify with the kind of the white industrial working classes of Canada's big cities have certainly been taken apart by these things, and partly victims of their success, right? Victims of like the success of collective bargaining, earning higher wages and allowing for people to own homes in different parts. They could escape working class neighborhoods. So the question then becomes, well, how do we recreate some form, or how do we identify what infrastructures of dissent might now exist, even though we're maybe not we're not seeing them? Like, I think they do exist, but they might not be where we think they are, or we might not be part of them. But I also think that, it raises the question of how we might create new ones. And that's a harder one. That's a harder one because like the social geography of how we live we can't easily replicate what Alan Sears is talking about in those moments. But that being said, I think it's interesting what activity there is there's a neighborhood association, but like I'm part of a choir that meets at a pub every week and has been doing so for 10 years. And it's a, sure, I'm not going to say that it's a working class choir, in the strict sense, like people that come from all walks of life, but it is a kind of a space where we are meeting to co-create art, and we have occasion then to talk about much more than the songs that we're singing. And I think that, those things exist. If we can think about those spaces with some greater intentionality, we might be able to start to recuperate some of those spaces or create those spaces with intention to reinvigorate the infrastructures of dissent in a more organic way.
I'd just quickly add to that. I think too, like we do have things that still exist from the past that were central to those infrastructures of dissent, that now there's more far-flung communities, but they still exist in central business districts or in gentrifying areas more often than not, and they can be used, right? And this goes back to like Dolores Hayden's concept of the power of place, where these old historic structures where a strike happened in this park becomes imbued with meaning. And people respond to it on a very, like, you take people there and you talk about the strike, and they live all over the place, but they remember that, and then you hear from someone that they heard from some. So I think that's a tool as well. And you have museums like WAC embedded in a community in a building that they never wanted to begin with. They wanted to go out and take their programming to where the workers were. The last thing they wanted was a museum, but guess what we got? Thank you, Bob Ray. Contrasted with the Graphic History Collective, who does it all online and figures out a way to do it. So I think looking to those new practices, there might be some answers too.
All right. Thank you to both of you for answering those questions. I think we have the Art of Solidarity for sale at the back. We have refreshments there as well. And please join me in thanking our speakers tonight.